You're listening to international investment advisor Doug Goldstein on the Goldstein on Gelt show, the financial show where we'll talk about how you can make the most of your money. With all the confusing financial chatter bombarding you each and every day, Goldstein on Gelt will give you the practical information you want and need about living a financially stable life. Here's your host, money maven Doug Goldstein.
Okay, we are back. I'm very happy to have on the Goldstein on Gelt show Jim Rogers, who's the author of Street Smarts, Adventures on the Road and in the Markets. Jim, it's a real pleasure to have you.
I am delighted to be here, Doug.
You are actually a well-known person on Wall Street. You're in the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, and in fact, you made your fortune by the time you were 40. How did you do that?
Well, I was always pretty focused. I knew I wanted to buy my freedom at a young age because I grew up without much money, and I didn't like it. So I wanted to buy my freedom. So I spent most of my time doing what I loved, which was the stock market, the investment markets, I should say. And when you do what you love and you spend a lot of time and energy at it, sometimes you're successful.
There certainly are a lot of people who focus a great deal of time and energy on the markets and are not so successful. What do you think differentiated you?
Well, I don't know. I know I was always skeptical and curious and never followed the crowd. I know that following the crowd has never been a way to success in any field that I can think of. So, no. If you do your own thinking, independent thinking, become skeptical, question everything, and go against the crowd, you're probably going to be successful.
All right. What were some of the specific ideas that you did that were against what the common knowledge was?
Oh, I guess maybe one of the most recent ones was in 1998, 1999. I decided the commodities had come to the end of the bear market. And, of course, most people poo-pooed and ignored and talked down about commodities. And yet I was right. It was the beginning of a nice bull market. When everybody else was ignoring it. They still don't quite understand it, but that was one that was somewhat recent. Buying Japan during the tsunami was another one. Most people sell when there's a tsunami or something terrible, but my experience is it's usually best to buy at a time like that.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that trading in commodities is something that's appropriate for regular investors?
Well, investors should not invest in anything that they don't know about. If you cannot spell commodities, you certainly should not be investing in commodities. But commodities are certainly easier. I'm not saying they're easier, but easier to understand and know about than stocks. I mean, not even the chairman of Toyota can know Toyota. He's got hundreds of thousands of employees, parts, et cetera, et cetera. Cotton's pretty simple. All you got to know is there too much cotton or too little cotton? I didn't say it was easy. I just said it's a lot simpler to invest in commodities than it is, stocks. We none of us knew what a .com was, and yet millions of people poured money into it. Well, we all know what sugar is. We all know what wheat is, and yet people are afraid of investing in wheat and sugar and coffee, but they'll run out and invest in .com, and they don't have a clue what they're talking about.
Do you think that any of these commodity markets are sort of manipulated by the ultra big players?
Well, I mean, conceivably people can try to manipulate anything, but commodities are the second largest market in the world. So if someone manipulates one of the commodity markets, they won't be able to do it very long because these markets are just too big and they'll be overwhelmed.
Mm-hmm. And you seem to encourage people to invest in commodities. When you say that, do you mean buying something and holding it, or being a trader both on the long and short side?
Well, again, if you don't know what you're doing, please don't do anything.
Okay, good disclaimer.
But if you know what you're doing, yes, commodities staggering amounts of money can be made in anything if you know what you're doing and if you pay attention. But again, if you don't know what you're doing, please, as many people have found out with .com, for instance, back to that. So please don't invest unless you know what you're doing. But if you know what you're doing, you can make a vast fortune in just about anything. And I strongly urge people to stay with what they know. If you know a lot about sports, invest in sports, and don't go off investing in something you don't know. In gold, if you don't know anything about gold, but you know a lot about sports, invest in gold. And invest in sports and ignore gold. Just stay with what you know.
Mm-hmm. So tell us a little bit about your book, Street Smarts. How did you come to write this?
Well, I've done a few books in my day, to my shock and surprise. And my publisher said, listen, there are a lot of people who want to know the whole story. I never sort of told the whole story. So I said, well, okay, I'll tell you the whole story. It's really more a memoir than anything else about how I got from there to here and many of my views along the way. I made plenty of mistakes. So it talks about some of my mistakes and some of my successes and what I've learned.
All right. We are talking with Jim Rogers, who's the author of Street Smarts, Adventures on the Road and in the Markets. He's also the author of a number of other books, and he's quite a stalwart on Wall Street, quoted all over the place, from the Washington Post to the New York Times and Barron's and Forbes and Fortune. Jim, you also wrote a book called A Bull in China. China is a very difficult country for many people to enter because they just don't understand the culture. What are some of the highlights that you think people could learn about China to make them better investors there?
Well, again, don't invest in anything unless you think you know what you're doing. I visited China many times. I'm very optimistic about the future of China. In my view, China is going to be the most important country in the 21st century. I've moved to Asia so that my children will grow up knowing Asia and speaking perfect Mandarin. So I've spent a lot of time, energy, money trying to learn about China and Asia. You can ask me in 40 years if I'm right or not. But in the meantime, there are many, as you probably know, China's been the most successful country in the past 30 years. So if that continues, there have been and there will be great opportunities there.
So one of the rumors that I guess that I've heard related to China is that though it continues to be a communist country, they allow the whole capitalist system to thrive, and they seem to have found a fair balance between the two. Is that your impression?
Oh, Doug, they're among the best capitalists in the world. Yeah, they call themselves communists. I know people who tell you they are the best capitalists in the world right now. California is more communist than China. Israel is more communist than China, for goodness sakes. If you want to do something in China, you're probably going to be able to do it and do it well and make a lot of money.
So what's the driving force behind the success in China?
Well, China's the only country in world history that I know of that's had recurring periods of greatness. You know, Rome was great once, Egypt was great once, Great Britain was great once, but China's had extraordinary success 3 or 4 times in the past few thousand years. They've also had 3 or 4 periods of catastrophe, absolute unmitigated disaster. But in 1978, Deng Xiaoping, the leader, said we got to try something new. China had been in decline for 300 or 400 years at that point, and he opened up entrepreneurship and capitalism again. And in China, they save and invest over 35% of their income. They work from dawn to dusk. I mean, they're like Great Britain was 200 years ago, like America was 100 years ago. There are enormous opportunities, at least in my view.
So do you think that it's reasonable if someone wants to piggyback on that growth to buy into, let's say, a China fund or a China ETF, or does he really have to be more specific?
Well, if you know the manager of a fund and you know something about him and you think he or she is smart, that's a good way to do it. Or an ETF, if you know enough about what's in the ETF and if you know enough about China. But again, I will repeat for at least 100 times on this show, people should not invest in anything unless they themselves know a lot about it. Don't listen to me or some guy on the radio or the TV. Just stick with what you know. Otherwise, you're going to lose a lot of money.
So let's talk a little bit about what formed you and the way that you view the world. Part of your, I'm guessing, a real formative experience you had was when you traveled around the world in a Mercedes-Benz for over 1,000 days. How has that influenced the way you looked at the world?
Well, before that, I drove a motorcycle around the world. I spent 2 years driving around the world on a motorcycle. I wrote a book about it called Investment Biker. And then a decade later, at the turn of the millennium, my then fiance, now my wife, Paige Parker, and I spent 3 years driving around the world at the turn of the millennium. Well, Doug, if you want to know the world, the best way to know it is from the ground up. I mean, don't sit and read about it or listen about it or watch it on TV. Go and do it. And you will find you will find that many of the things that you have thought were correct in the world are not correct in the world. Because the world out there, seeing the world from the ground up, will teach you a lot.
Did it teach you anything about the way you choose investments?
Well, not about the way I choose investments, but more about some of the investments I chose. When I first went to China in 1984, I was terrified. I was told all these horrible red Chinese communists, they'll slit your throat, etc. I got there and found out that nearly everything I'd ever been told about China from a Western propaganda point of view was inaccurate. If they were like the rest of us, they were just as ambitious and hardworking and wanted the same things for their families that we want for ours. And then I got more and more involved, and I realized that China, now I live in Asia. My children speak Mandarin. I've got investments in China because I found out close to the ground that most of the stuff that we've been led to believe was inaccurate.
Wow. So obviously, leaving the United States was a pretty big move. It was a statement in where you believe the future is really going to be. What's your take on what's going to be happening in the U.S., let's say, over the next 5-10 years?
Well, the U.S. is the largest debtor nation in the history of the world, Doug. I don't particularly like saying that since I'm an American citizen, voter, and taxpayer, but I have to face facts if I'm going to deal with reality and with the world. America's certainly in relative decline, if not absolute decline. The largest creditor nations in the world are China, Korea, Japan, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Singapore. I mean, the assets, the money's in Asia. You know who the debts are and where they are, and the debts are getting worse, not better.
Okay, I guess that doesn't bode well. And do you think the United States will have a hard time to pay off that debt? Or will be able to at all?
Well, it's humanly impossible for the U.S. to pay off its debt. It will pay it off someday, but it'll do it in worthless currency. I don't think you're ever going to pick up your newspaper one day and the U.S. is going to say, "Aha, we're not paying our bills anymore." What will happen is you'll pick up your newspaper and find out that the currency is worthless, and they'll pay you, but it'll be in worthless currency.
Well, that wouldn't be good for China then, who is owed a lot of money by the U.S.
Yes, well, we'll have to wait and see what China does. In the meantime, China may have other plans for its money. I mean, they could buy rice, they could buy gold, they could buy lots of things if they want to going forward. But yes, you're right. Let's suppose that nothing changes. China sits there and holds its U.S. dollars and U.S. bonds. Well, they will not be happy if what I just said happens. But on the other hand, normally it's better to be the creditor than the debtor when people are suffering. Even if you're the creditor who suffers, you're usually better off being the creditor than the debtor in the end.
All right, that sounds like good advice. We've been talking with Jim Rogers. Jim, in the last few seconds, just tell me, how can people follow your work?
Oh, I have a website. I guess my website is jimrogers.com, but you can go, Google, YouTube. Apparently I'm on all these things a lot of times. There's some blogs, but they're not official. They're, imposters who set up blogs and Twitter accounts and things like that. I don't have anything to do with Twitter or Facebook or the blog, but they are there. They're just not mine.
All right, so we'll look for your books on Amazon, and we can go to jimrogers.com.
Absolutely.
All right, Jim.
I hope to see you again.
All right, thanks so much for your time.
Very good. Thank you, Doug.
You've been listening to the Goldstein on Gelt Show with money maven Doug Goldstein. Doug's weekly radio show is heard around the world, but if you miss it, you can download the podcast at www.goldsteinongelt.com. The Goldstein on Gelt Show gives you up-to-date financial ideas so you can get on the path to financial freedom. If you'd like your questions answered on the air or off, send Doug an email to doug@profile-financial.com. It's your money for your future, so join Doug every week to build your wealth on the Goldstein on Gelt Show.